Alrighty, there's our audio. Sorry, I blew it away on accident. That was not intentional, and you'll have to forgive me, or you won't. So, um, yeah, I'm just glad y'all are here. If you're, again, as always, I'm trying to do some things here all at the same time, but I really need to hire me a production
technical stuff here.
a technical production manager. My keyboard's not working, so
Today's the day.
today's the day. It is the day that the Lord had made, and we will rejoice and be glad in it. If you're out there watching, let us know you're watching. We would appreciate that. I'm gonna throw up the chats up here in case anybody starts chiming in a minute. I think I've got everything worked out now. Do I, Tim?
I don't know. We got audio.
We got audio.
We
We're
got
talking.
picture showing.
Yeah, we got a picture and we got audio. And
Well, you got your boots on. You can walk into combat. Let's go.
So, bless you all for having to look at our mugs this morning. But it is Friday, and it has been a day. I ain't gonna lie.
Yeah, it has been a day.
All right. Guys, there's some days that this walk with the Lord is easy, and there's some days that this walk with the Lord is hard. Our topic today was just kind of about prayer and how prayer works into when life is just reaping it on you. And
Well, in the scriptural scenario they were using was the people coming out of And last week we talked a little bit about the, Pharaoh deciding to go ahead and take off after him because when they woke up, they didn't have any servants and nothing was getting done. Because a larger part of the population were the slaves.
Right.
So all of a sudden there was a massive hole, so to speak. And today the Israelites are packed up next to the Red Sea, and they hear the chariots rumbling, so to speak, and they start going into a panic mode. And it says that they started crying out to the Lord. And so in the Red Sea Rules here book that they had, he's bringing up the point that they were, they broke out in prayer, right? They're in panic mode, and they're,
it's Exodus 14 for anybody.
yeah, it's Exodus 14. And so it's pretty easy just to look at that and go, oh, well, we need to pray. We should pray. That's an academic answer.
Yeah.
I don't mean to make light of that by any stretch, but sometimes when we don't know what to do, especially when we're in teaching ministry, we just start falling back on, I don't know, it's almost cliche. I don't think that's what's really happening here, but it could come across that way. But at any rate, they start panicking and they start crying out to the Lord. And I think you have to look at this in a bigger picture. These were not people that didn't know who God was.
Yeah.
They had lived in, go ahead and break out to both.
I mean,
these were not people that didn't know who God was, or at least what they thought of him. They'd been in captivity for what, 400-ish years?
long time.
And they'd probably been, going through life and drudging through it and praying. This was before the temple and some kind of super ordered form had been put in place, I think. But they knew who Abraham was. They knew who Jacob was. They knew who all these guys were. And so how to pursue God and what to look at him like in terms, I think they had a pretty good grasp of that. And they did it too. I think they prayed and they sought the Lord in their hardship and all those kinds of things. My point is that all of us, especially if you've lived in the Christian world and well, I'm supposed to pray and I'm supposed to read my Bible and I do go to church and I listen and I'm fed. So you have some familiarity of what's going on. And then we start running into how we're wired. And I'm talking from an eternal perspective. I've told people before, you can tell me you're an atheist if you want to.
Yeah.
You have no clue what you're saying because you have been created by God, or as we believe that, right? So they were also created to commune with God. So they left. They were complaining about it from the very first time they set foot out after they had a party.
Mm-hmm.
And then they get to the Red Sea and they got nowhere to go and the trouble's coming and they just start panicking and they start crying out to the Lord. And I would tell you, you'd say, oh, well, yeah, when you get pressured up, you're going to look for God to get you out of your trouble. Well, as I read the Psalms and the New Testament and the Old Testament, there's a lot of places where God says, not only that's what you're going to do, that's what you need to do.
Well, and
It's naturally wired is my point.
you know, it is. And, you know, just full transparency. I mean, that's just kind of how I roll. And if that doesn't suit you, I guess listen to a different podcast. But,
Grouch.
I'm not a grouch. Just I started reading this book on the recommendation of a pastor friend of mine. Just because our family's getting the crap kicked out of them, and
Yeah.
it's
There's been
just
a lot of that today, by the way.
there's been a lot of that
so
today.
we're
This for both of us. This has just been one of those days where you're just getting the crap kicked out of you every time you turn around, and we want to. I'm not just sitting here going, this is the best book I've ever read. It's got some great stuff in it. But there were some things in this particular chapter 4, that I didn't appreciate. And part of that is that, well, let me back up. Let me give you the sugar before we give you the castor oil. What I did appreciate was just it brings out a lot in the scriptures about, and we see this over and over. We see it if you don't believe me, read the Psalms. When David got pinched, that's what he did. He just cried out to the Lord, vanquish my enemies, bring me out of this, don't depart from me, da, 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 da. And you see this in Exodus 14 when they got pinched. And like what Tim's saying is, don't blow off the fact that, oh, sure, you're getting pinched. Of course, you're going to pray. There's a reason that we do that. It's not just because that's our fail-safe. What I didn't appreciate about this chapter in the book is it takes this this approach that if you pray hard enough, believing enough, and with enough people, everything's going to be fine. Everything, and by fine, I mean your problem's going to be fixed and the thing's going to be over with.
It's going to be fixed how
Humanly
you would see
speaking.
it needs to be fixed.
And every fiber of my being, because that's so close to the prosperity gospel garbage, and I will apologize ahead of time. I'm probably tired enough today that I may seem grouchy, but I'm just shooting you from the hip today. The prosperity gospel is just a steaming pile of dog poo, because this idea that if you just do it right, everything's going to turn out the way you think it ought to, is one of the biggest lies that Satan wants to sell us. And I go back to the first chapter of this book that I was so championing is that whatever God brings us to, he brought us to it. And we were talking about that kind of before we got on the air, is for both of us are kind of facing some just crapola today. Nothing you can do about it. You just got to what did you say? Put your boots on and go into battle.
Yeah.
And you just got to deal with it. The exercise and the discipline, we're talking about prayer, is to breathe, intellectually remind ourselves that if we're going through it, God brought us to it.
Yeah, and so there's scriptural proof of all that through the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Well, even if it's consequences, okay? And so we haven't really gotten into prayer yet, but when you look into Exodus 14, like Tim was saying, it's just so natural to say, well, of course they were praying. And we're having bad days today. And people might say, well, of course you're going to be praying today because your day has sucked. Maybe your week, month, whatever. But what Tim's saying, and I would just wholeheartedly agree with, it's not just that when everything gets down, you pray. It's in our DNA as image bearers to cry out to our Creator when we don't know what else to do.
Well, and even in our time, the non-Christian, the heathen, the one who hasn't accepted Christ, whether willfully or it hadn't been presented to him yet, you put them in a bad enough situation and they're going to start crying out to something.
Yeah.
I've seen it. I
Well,
can't tell you how many times I've seen it.
A great example, we use it all the time, it's kind of ad nauseum, was the Sunday after 9/11. And we were going to church in Athens, and I remember, I mean, that church, I don't know how much it was running there, maybe a couple hundred. Building seats, probably 5, I don't know, I'm guessing. And dude, I remember that next Sunday, the place was jammed. I mean, we had this big picture, if you remember, it went viral on social media was back then. You know, it's in everybody's emails, it's on the news, of all of Congress, both houses of Congress, all of the cabinet standing out, reciting the Pledge of Allegiance and praying and calling for a national day of prayer. Everybody believed in God for about 6 months.
Yeah.
Because it's innate in us.
It is innate.
It's innate in us.
You don't have to like it. You don't even have to believe it or think you don't believe it. But it was wired there by him, by the Creator himself.
And that's why when we talk about when Jesus walked on the water, that's not the miracle to me.
No.
The creation responded to the Creator, and that
Sure
doesn't
did.
surprise me. What surprises me is that Peter walked on the water. And when we're talking about prayer, I guess what I wanted to say today was, for me, I guess the best compliment I ever had was somebody said, it seems like your ministry is just an overflow of whatever pile you're going through. And
yeah,
there's
I understand that.
I guess I've got a couple of 3 different categories of prayer that I live and walk in every day. Paul says to pray without ceasing. I used to really struggle with that. As I've learned to practice, and I don't, it doesn't come naturally, it's practiced of not just talking to God, but listening to God. And that's not a euphemism. It's just like, shut your stinking mouth and listen. I'm feeling worked up. It's in my bones. But it's a discipline to pray and listen for that still small voice. There's that. And I do that throughout my day. Driving down the road, talking to the Lord. I need a parking place. Lord, would you help me? My legs hurt. I mean, they're dumb things, kind of. But it's a willful practice in conversation with my Creator. Because I want to know what he sounds like. I've got to know what he sounds like.
Yeah, that's good.
And then there's those times where it's worshipful. It's in my quiet time, and I'm just praying for people, praying for Tim, praying for my buddies, my family. You're taking petition. You're telling him how. I mean, it's a set aside time.
It's kind of a praising time.
It is a praising time.
Yeah.
I always start with that, and then people are like, "You pray too long." Well, I got to get through the praise part because I feel really guilty if I don't get through that part. Then I start asking for junk. But then there's those times where the other ones aren't working.
Yeah.
There's the sea, there's the mountains, there's the soldiers, and you're screwed.
Well, I think that they, in that particular instance, and I compared it to if you growed up in church or you've been saved or whatever it is, and you struggle with all these things. How do I pray? What does it look like? All that. Don't miss the fact that these were God's people.
Yeah.
And don't miss the fact that they'd been praying to him for 400 years under absolute austere conditions in every way imaginable. And now they're put under a transition of absolute certain death. And I'm not saying that they just started praying because it was innate. They were praying, one, because they probably thought that's what they needed to do, they had to do, and the innate thing came boiling out on top of it. They were doing what they were built to do under situations where you're like, you're not even thinking about God's going to be here and taking care of me, but you start screaming out at that. And the discipline thing, flash where they are and what's going on. If you can in your mind, flash to Moses standing right there.
Yeah.
I'm sure he was kind of getting a little worked up too, going, well, I sure hope this C parts when I stick this rod in here, like he said. But on the other hand, he's going, no, that's what he said to do.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm going to do. And he does it. Right. And we hadn't got to that part in the story because we're trying to show this thing about prayer. But I'm telling you that he brought, my point is that God worked that scenario out for them to have to go through that, even though they'd been kicked for 400 years, because he's getting them built for something else.
Well, and that's what, I mean,
That seems like it sucks, but that is how it works.
and I guess I think part of my aversion to, I don't even want to call it the prosperity gospel. It's not the gospel. It's prosperity garbage, hoopla, steaming pile of dog poo, is because that's not getting you ready for anything. I'm not saying the Lord doesn't bless you, and I'm not saying the Lord doesn't answer prayer, and I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that James Goodson says, bro, start over. I just got here. The more I study and the more that I live, the truism, I'm seeing it come true, the saying that says God cannot use a man whom he has greatly, a man whom he has not crushed thoroughly.
That doesn't mean you go looking to be crushed.
No,
but
but
yes,
there's going to be days like today when you are crushed. And I guess my encouragement is today is that prayer in the pinch is innate. It's in our DNA. It's spiritual fight or flight, but it's also something we're commanded to do, and it is something God listens to, and it's worth your time.
but he develops you to actually be able to do it. It's the way I see it. I don't know that at least for me, that's what's happened, because I would have never done those things on my own.
Well, I hear what you're saying, but I don't want to fly past, and I agree with it, 100%. But I don't want to run past the person that's out there that's not developed in that yet. And
Well,
it's
now
not
you can be
innate.
developed. He can do it so that you're trained. You can and you will, but you can go, nah, I don't want to.
Well, but that's
Now
not
that's a different conversation.
that's not what I'm saying. What
Okay.
I'm talking about is the person out there that's sitting here. They're in the pinch, and it's not that they don't want to pray. It's not rebellion. It's just not necessarily the first thing in their frontal cortex that comes up.
I got you.
We've got to be in the habit of talking to our Creator. It's like, I know Bruce is watching, and he was a weightlifter and he did MMA and all that stuff. I mean, you don't just, there's a video floating around the internet somewhere with him. I don't know if Bruce, you comment if you're watching. He either did or almost did, like, broke the, like, either state or some kind of record on leg press. It's crazy. It's like bajillion pounds. But you don't start there.
Yeah.
These people were in fight or flight and they prayed, but I guess the encouragement I want to give to myself today is a reminder that God sometimes brings you to the sea, puts you in between the mountains, so that the only thing you've got left to do is cry out to him.
Oh yeah.
And
That is
and
a common occurrence with him.
And it's not mean, it's not vindictive. It's one of the most loving, precious things that he can do for us, is to put us in front of the sea, in front of Pharaoh, between the mountains,
Yeah.
and take everything away from us but his goodness and his hope.
Yeah.
And it's an act of discipline to remember that some days.
And it's not easy to remember it when you get in a squeeze. And it's important to look at these people that were getting squeezed. Remember, I mean, I just described that they've been in captivity for 400 years in extreme austere conditions.
Yeah.
This ain't the first time some of them had been put to near death and crying out to God when they're getting stomped.
Well, and it won't be the last. It's
Well, the astounding thing is that they wound up that, and you would think, oh, well, they've been through all that. They would.
no, because
No, God put them in that position to show them that he's fixing to show what he's really made out of. That's a bad way to say that. But he's showing them that too, because it can always get worse. I hate to say that. It doesn't always seem worse when he's in the mix. But to me and you, it can seem that way pretty quick. And the more he's developing you, the more times you're going to wind up in some of these hard places, because that means that you're working as well as he is working. And it's almost like an acknowledgement from him. You mean he's going to acknowledge me more by putting me in a harder place? Yeah, he puts people that are developing in a hard place.
Well,
I don't like that, but
my chat widget, just add it to the pile. My chat widget's not working today, but Billy says, holy ground. He says, I don't know why pain and disappointment and hurt is, but it is. You know, Billy, you're right. And I guess when I was a young believer, I didn't know how to pray.
oh yeah,
There's a reason the disciples asked the. Man,
I would still tell you,
because I'm having a hard time today. There's a reason the disciples said, Lord, teach us how to pray.
Yeah,
Because they heard him pray.
they watched him pray.
They watched him pray. They
so
watched him steal away and
It
pray.
was different than what they had been seeing prayer as they knew it.
Exactly. And I remember longing for that kind of prayer.
Yeah,
I remember when I was in my early 20s, I went out to, Billy, you'll appreciate this, out into Stanford, Texas. Billy's watching. He was in Merkel, Texas at the time, and 45 minutes or so south. And we had come back from that, and it was a debacle on a lot of levels. But I was at Central Baptist in Athens, my home church, and the preacher that was there at the time, he was like, he asked me, did God call you to do this or not? You needed to figure that out. And I'm like, well, that's a great question. And I believe still today, he said, yeah, he did. This is what he built me for. And so he gave me a Sunday school class. And he said, I want you to treat it like it's your church. And we did. But one of the things I felt like I need to do is I need to plug into Wednesday night prayer meeting. That's what you do, right? And when you're trying to grow. And I walked into that first couple of meetings. I remember walking in there, and I was like 20. I wish this would stop glitching. It's really bothering me. I don't know why it's doing it. I apologize. The room was full of these old dudes. Like, I'm in there with all these. I mean, like, at the time, I thought these guys were the ancients, you know.
yeah.
They were probably 70. And there was one cat in particular. His name was Ira Kinsey. He's dead now. Just a farmer. I mean, backwoods.
Yeah.
Not dumb. I don't mean it like that. I mean, dude was brilliant, but he was just a guy. And I'm sitting on, they had pews around the Sunday school room that we were in. And I remember, got time to pray, and I leaned over on my knees, put my head in my hands, and I heard a bunch of shuffling. I look around, and all these old dudes with broke down knees are crawling on the floor. And Ira started praying. And I've never heard anything like that before.
Mm.
And I never forgot it.
That's good stuff.
And he sat there and he wept, soaked that pew. And then it was like somebody's tapping me to pray, and I'm like, I'm not praying. Not after that. And I identify with the disciple, saying, Lord, teach us to pray. And I'll never forgot how Ira Kinsey, he talked to God like Moses did. He didn't have a theology degree, but he had learned how to tap into the way God made him. And it was good. And I've learned in years since that dude went through some stuff.
Yeah.
And there's a guy that sits in front of us at church now, named Bobby, and we've gotten to know him a little bit, and it's just one of those old guys, comes in his overalls, sits down with his cane, and when the worship comes on, he just weeps. And we were like,
Yeah.
hey, that dude's got a story. We don't know that story yet. We've learned some of it. I'm like, we're like, but before we knew him, we were like, he worships, he prays from a place
Yeah.
of suffering, and it means more. And as we've learned more about him, he's been in some deep, deep rivers. And
Feel like a rookie whenever you're doing
dude,
stuff like
I'm
that.
just like, I'm over here just, but what those kind of guys do for me is they remind me that not only are you going to be okay, even if you're not okay, you're okay. When I was a young man, I mean, parenthetical here, when I was a young man, I always remembered thinking, I want to be like this guy or that. I always want to be like Ira Kinsey because he was sweet and he was gentle
Yeah.
and he always talked about the Lord and everybody loved him. He wasn't perfect. I promise you. I don't know the humanist side of him. All I knew was church side of him. But he was just being the Lord. And I just didn't know then what it took to be that.
Yeah.
You got to get your teeth kicked in to be like that. And looking back down that, I always want to be that. But it's just a good, sweet reminder that even on days like today, or whatever your day is, we can do what they did. I would just take umbrage with the guy that wrote this book. It doesn't mean that they're going to get delivered all the time.
Not
Sometimes
here.
sometimes you do, but sometimes you don't.
Yeah.
Because when you go to the book of Numbers, what is it, 14? When they decided they were going to just go take the place, and Moses was like, no, we're not going,
If you're going, the ark's not.
the ark's not going, and him and
Actually, him and Caleb and Joshua.
Joshua stayed behind. I always get this picture. I mean, they didn't do this, but like they're just kind of sitting around, whittling by the ark, waiting for everybody. And they got routed, man. They got routed.
Big time.
And their rebellion cost them a bunch of lives. They didn't get to go. I mean, it was just this whole big deal. They didn't always get delivered. But God never did leave them.
Yeah.
And that, I'm reminded when he said, all right, you bunch of numbskulls, you're going to wander in the desert till all you idiots die. And the rest of your kids and your grandkids will get to go in, but you're not going. A couple things happened. God stayed with them.
Through their misery.
And he made Moses and Aaron and Joshua stay with him too.
Yeah.
And they had to suffer.
They had to deal with their consequences.
And if it wasn't
That's
for the
pretty normal.
second rock thing, Moses would have gotten to go in.
Yeah.
But it's just a reminder that sometimes the crap you're going through is so you can help somebody else. Almost always, so you can help somebody else through that. Tammy and I had this conversation the other day. It's like, through our life, we've always been able to see as we look back on seasons of difficulty. What do you take out of those? What are you learning? The biggest lessons is that God's so sweet and near in those times. And I'm looking in this, and these guys are getting up here to the sea, and they're praying. I'm sure they were elated when the sea parted. I know they were. They're like, we're getting out. But I would wager that the real blessing in that was not that the sea parted, is that they connected with their Creator.
Well, yeah, and that's why he even did it. He even says that.
Yeah.
Well, what does that mean for us now? I'm standing at some precipice and the sea doesn't always seem to part.
Yeah.
Well, I don't really know how to answer that, but I do know that God doesn't leave. So, when it was written that David was someone after God's own heart, it was after David had already done all the stupid things, and he lived the rest of his life in utter turmoil with his sons and all the stuff going on and the wars that were going on, and all of it was because of what he did.
Yep.
And so they're living here, to me, that's hope. that he has put into me.
Yeah.
And I can't make heads or tails out of it, because in my simple way of thinking, if I'm doing well and good, then everything should be well and good and pretty easy. And you said looking back. Man, when I'm looking back, it is God's graciousness that I get to see, and I get to see how big he really is. But my initial reaction when I look back now, I can laugh at those things, because back then they weren't laughable. It was ugly. But I'm laughing at myself thinking, man, I was such an idiot.
Well, what is it you always say though, that when God's providence figures in our stupidity, God's plan already figures in our stupidity.
Yeah.
And this little book did share some scriptures that were good for me today. Mark 5, when Jairus came to Jesus, and it says he begged him earnestly. My little daughter lies at the point of death. Luke 7, same thing. They came to Jesus and begged him in earnestness. Jesus, when he was in agony, prayed more earnestly. Luke 22. And it just goes on and on and on. Elijah did it. You see it in Colossians. And it's just this idea of sometimes it's easy to be like, well, I did my prayer. I said it. He's either going to do what he's going to do or he's not. And that's not a terrible place to be in. But there's something to be said for earnest prayer.
Yeah, so you get to a place, I think, where you do earnest prayer. At least in my case, I am not the example of going and learning how to pray. I can tell you that right now. But sometimes his spirit comes upon me and I can't do anything but pray in earnestness.
Yeah.
For whatever. And you may say, well, I don't know what to pray when I'm supposed to pray. Well, I'm telling you that you were built that way. You want to know how to pray? Watch some little kid that's 4, 5, 6 years old go up and say, Mama, can you do this? Or Daddy, I want to do that. Or
I love you, Mama.
It's just something that pours out of them.
Yeah.
That's what God's looking for you to almost do, to be able to live recklessly like they do.
Yeah.
Seeming recklessly, right? Because I don't know, when you get too sophisticated, you start going, oh, well, you can't talk to God like that, or you shouldn't be doing it. And maybe you shouldn't where you're at, but he's putting those things together. Just do it is my point.
Yeah.
Do it. Pray when you're walking. Pray when you see something. Hey, Lord, can you help me find a parking place? God, that seems so stupid and shallow, but you know what? When it starts becoming just, and you think, oh, old people, they don't, they're losing their mind. That's why they pray like that. No, that's not why they're praying that way.
Figuring it out.
They're figuring it out.
I know.
Those are things to watch. That's what the disciples, when they were watching Jesus pray, they'd watched hundreds of Pharisees pray. They had watched all kinds of formal functioning doing that. But when they were watching him do it,
it was different.
It was completely different. That was the one that was going, Father this and Father that, like he's standing right there in front of him, and he was.
Well, and even in the garden the night before the crucifixion, there's a lot in there. I think Jesus wanted them to pray for themselves because he knew what they were fixing to face without him. They needed to be praying for him. He was struggling. I mean, and he needed them to see him do that. It's just like him getting baptized. They needed to see him in that spot.
Yeah.
And as I read Exodus 14, so many thoughts, but when you're in the pinch, it's natural to cry out in earnestness to prayer. The hard part is crying out in earnestness when you're not in the pinch and making that a part of your day and part of your walk, so that when you're in the pinch, it's not just fight or flight. It is the natural, logical thing for you to do.
Yes.
And I don't mean you come at me with a spider, you're probably going to get hit in the mouth. Okay? That's going to be my natural response. I had a kid in my youth group one time. They were like, I'm going to throw this spider on you. And I'm like, dude, don't do it. Do not do it.
I'm laughing because I've seen him in those modes
And,
anyway.
and man, he tossed the spider on me. And I jumped and flailed my arms to get away from the spiders. I'm terrified of them. And if any of y'all out there see that and bring a fuzzy spider around, I can't be responsible for what happens. But I smacked the kid. I just jumped and one of my hands popped him. I didn't feel bad at all. I was like, don't do that. Prayer can be that way.
Yeah.
You're in the pinch but it's really good. And it's still good and formative and great. And he's near and he's like, oh, good, there you are. But when it's also, I think of it like there's my reaction to a spider and then there's like Chuck Norris's reaction to a spider. He might still jump and get out of the way, but it's a much more calculated, coordinated physical event than if I'm doing it.
Right.
And he wants us for when we see the pinch coming, when the sea's on the horizon and we know they're behind us, but we're not to the sea yet, we're like, oh, that's going to be bad when we get there. Then you can start praying in earnestness then and start preparing your heart. I have a ritual, and I think I've talked about this before. Every morning when I get Brenda out of bed, she's usually mad because I woke her up. And she has this thing that she does. She leans on my shoulder, my left shoulder, not the right one, the left one's got to be the same. And I put my arm around the back of her head and she puts her left arm around the back of my head every morning without fail. And she's usually giving us verbal protest at that point because I pulled her out of bed. She's hollering at me. But in that little moment, it's just part of my day. I real quickly just thank you, Lord, for waking her up today.
Mm.
I hope she touches somebody's life today, and I wish you'd heal her, let her walk, and let her talk to her.
Yeah, amen.
Every day. And there are times when that's a really sweet moment with her, but every time it's kind of a sweet moment with the Lord. And in some ways, that's right in the middle of the pinch.
Yeah.
But by the same token, it's just it's just a day for us. And so it's when you get in the habit of communing, and it's not just, I have to close my eyes and be whatever, but you're in constant communion with the Lord. When you see the pinch coming, when the pinch comes out of nowhere and you don't see it, it's not just fight or flight. You can develop it to be an intentional part of who you are, not just because it's in your DNA, but it's that plus it's part of your disciplined walk with the Lord as well, and your identity in Him.
Well, and it also brings to a point that that's actually a more natural state.
Yeah, natural may be a tough word, but it's it's
so what I'm
closer to what
saying
He made us
is
to be.
take out Adam and Eve and you're in the garden.
Right.
You would more naturally do that all the time anyway.
Yeah, what does it say? They walked with Him in the cool of the day. That doesn't just mean they took a stroll on the beach.
Yeah.
That's communion.
Communing in a big way.
And
the kind of stuff we want to be able to commune.
Well, and that's why they hid after Genesis 3.
Oh, yeah.
They, because their fellowship was so intimate, they knew in their own inner being that things were no longer the same.
Yeah.
And that's why they hid. It wasn't just shame. They covered themselves because they knew that everybody's like, there's this weird part in the scriptures about that they were naked and unashamed before Genesis 3. Why did they cover themselves? Because they knew that they were naked. It wasn't just knowledge. They each knew that the other could no longer be trusted.
Yeah.
And the reason that like a man and a woman married couple can be naked and unashamed is because you're trustworthy. You can trust that person with everything. But what happened in the garden was Adam knew Eve could no longer be trusted with his vulnerability, and she knew that he could no longer be trusted with his vulnerability. So they covered themselves to hide that vulnerability, and we've been covering ourselves ever since.
Yep.
But Jesus still came into the garden, and Jesus still came to walk with them, and he asked them some really hard questions, but that doesn't mean he didn't walk with them. And he banished them from the garden, but that doesn't mean he didn't walk with them.
Well, he's still looking at them because he knows how they're built and well, I would tell you how it really is, but it looks like, oh, y'all have messed this up. It's the same way that a mama can look at her child who is an absolute horrid mess and they see something different than what they're actually doing.
How many of you have ever felt or heard someone say, they're not a bad kid? That's not who they are. I know what they're doing, but this is not who they are. That's because you can see past what's going on into the
Yeah.
reality, past the
That's
shadow.
a
into the
creator
reality.
looking at what's there.
Yeah, and God looks at us that way.
Sure he does.
And when we commune with him through prayer, we enter into what he sees of us as being true and real, instead of just walking in what we'd like to be true and real, or to look like. And I guess, I mean, we're going to wrap up, but the encouragement today, this whole level exercise in this silly little book is how to deal with hard times.
Yeah.
And there's silly stuff in it. There's some good reminders in it. But Mike said at church Sunday, you're either in a wreck, coming out of a wreck, or about to go into one. That's the only three people you got. And I that has been my experience, and that's true. If your prayer life is, I'm going to say, in bad shape, just fix it. But somebody's going to say, well, what's my prayer life supposed to look like? I want to encourage you to stop trying to figure out what your prayer life is supposed to look like, and just go talk to him, and then sit there and be quiet for a little bit.
Just start crying out.
Just start crying out like they did. God, I'm in a pinch. Or, hey, I'm not in a pinch right now, but I want to be ready for that when it comes.
Yeah.
What do you want me to know about you today? And then just listen, take a walk, look in the trees, sing a song. It's not difficult. But we make it difficult we got to pray. And I know the scriptures say, and Jesus even told him, in this way pray. And well, if you don't say Jesus, in Jesus' name, it didn't count. I've heard people say that. And I get it, but
Sorry.
I mean, and I know what they mean, but what they're meaning and what they're saying are really not the same thing. And I do that, there's more to it than just this mantra of putting the right plug on it. It's not witchcraft. It's a recognition of the fact that I'm even getting to talk to God because Jesus died and covered me. Because if I walk into the presence of the Lord, I'm over there with Moses, and he's like, you can't see my face or you'll die. Yeah. But with Jesus, we get to do that. We get to boldly go in. And I guess my encouragement is, you're going to have days like Tim and I are having today that are going to be hard, and you're just not going to know what to do. You need people like Tim. You need people that'll remind you that God is still good. And the fact of and it's not just because he's good in spite of what you're going through. His goodness may be what you're going through.
I would tell you that it is what you're going through.
And because he loves you enough to let you go through it.
Yeah.
And I don't know a parent worth their salt that sheds a whole lot of tears when they have to discipline their little kids because they don't want them to be hellions when they get older. And yeah, it's hard and all that, but but you get over it. And it's not even always discipline. When you're watching your kid walk, you don't weep and cry, oh, they fell over on their third step. Oh. No, you celebrate the steps they made, because it's going to get them to walking and running and playing and all those things. And I just think God looks at us that way. And you got to tap into who he is. You got to talk with him. And when you have dark nights of the soul, just cry out to him. Well, what does that look like? I don't know what it looks like for you. I don't. Go sit on the back of your tailgate at night when everybody's in bed and look up at the stars and I've done this so many times. I walk right out here. I'll look up at the stars at night when it's dark, just in tears, and be like, Lord, I don't know what to say to you.
Find a place where you don't have any activity.
Yeah.
That's a hard thing to do, especially these days. But you go someplace where, and you start going through this struggle of, got to have something coming in. No.
Shut it off. Leave the phone in the house.
And you'll start having some response.
And I can tell you with all certainty, if you will seek a relationship with the Lord, and I'm not talking about being saved, I'm talking about if you will seek this prayerful communion with the Lord, he will meet you.
Oh yeah.
And when I realized that the Lord shared with me several years ago, we were started doing communion every Sunday, and it kind of, at first I was like, this is lost its special nature. And
Not really.
one day when I was having it, I don't know if it was a vision or what. We were doing communion, and it was just, I looked, I was in prayer, and I just looked up, and in my mind's eye, it was as clear as a bell. It was like everybody in the church that had a little cup was sitting at one of those little Italian tables, one-on-one with Jesus. And he was sitting with everybody like over coffee. And the look on his face was just beaming because he was so happy you were there to commune with him.
Yeah. That's cool.
And that changed its outlook for me. And it's not just the cup and the bread.
Yeah.
It's like that all the time. So that when you get in the pinch and the sea and the Pharaohs and the mountains are there, it's just another part of sitting across the table from.
Yeah.
So I
Sounds
want to
good.
encourage you, if you don't know how to pray, you know what to pray. Well, the preacher said, you just pray what you got. It's in your spiritual DNA. He made you for it. Just sit, listen, be quiet, say what's on your heart and your mind. He knows it anyway. You're not going to offend him. Say, well, what's on my mind is not kosher. He's all right.
Yeah.
He'll be all right. All right. Just tell him how you're feeling and pursue that, because when you need it, when the sea and the mountains and the Pharaohs are there, you're going to need him. Well, you need him anyway, but I mean, you're really going to need him. And I just want to encourage you to cultivate that before you need him. It ain't bad to do it that way, but man, it's sweet. It's sweet. Kind of a rambly day today. Sorry about that. Just kind of in my feels today, I guess. But share the podcast. Got one announcement to make. If you're still with us, I don't know if anybody's even still with us or not. I probably wouldn't be. But we're shooting for June 1. I'm shooting for June 1 to relaunch our app. We've actually pulled the app down out of the stores. I believe it's down. To do a full revamp, and it's not going to be like just this kind of stuff repackaged. It's actually going to be all of our discipleship material in a very simple, bite-sized, followable format. It's going to be there's going to be text, it'll be in audio, there'll be some videos. I mean, and the design of it is honestly, we've been partnering with Real Vita TV. They reached out to us, and they've got a bunch of the people they've been ministering to in prison are getting out and needing some help walking through their discipleship. We've done the work. We're just putting it into a format that's so simple. I mean, God gave me this vision years ago, and finally it's just clearing up when it was time to need it. And so be looking for that. I'm going to ask repeatedly after June 1, go get the app, download the app, share the app, get as many people on it as we can, because it'll be a good evangelism tool too. If you've got somebody who's a prospective believer, it'll take them through the gospel. If they're a new believer, it'll help them grow. If they're a seasoned believer, it'll take you to places that you didn't know you needed to go. And so just look for that, and hope we'll get that going pretty soon. You got anything else?
No.
Sorry for being weepy. Sorry for it being a rough day. Some days it just is what it is. But God is good, and he is faithful, and he doesn't lead us to the sea just for grins.
Yeah.
He leads us to meet us. So we love you. We talk to you guys later. Y'all have a good time.